We are in the middle of a series that we're calling Now What? Talking about what it means to live as resurrection people in a hurting world. We're in the season of Easter. Easter is more than just a day, and we're looking at what resurrection means. What is the meaning of Easter? Not what happened, but what does it mean here, today? Not after we die and we all go to heaven, but what does it mean in the way that we make decisions and relate to one another, the way that we live our lives? On Easter Sunday, it's easy to live as a resurrection person, isn't it? But as we move deeper into the Easter season, as we get farther away from that day, especially in the midst of a global pandemic, it gets even harder and becomes more challenging. Now, you would think, right, that in the moments of crisis that it would be easier for us to come together. But as we are being reminded in the midst of this crisis, it's also showing some of our differences as well. Right now, across the United States, we are wrestling with how to create and to cultivate a common life together. We're trying to balance our economic needs with our health needs. We're trying to balance our isolation and our general stir craziness, if I may coin a term, with protecting the most vulnerable among us. The truth is, we don't always know the best, easiest way to do that. As a result of that, we are becoming, in many ways, deeply divided. You may remember just a few weeks ago when we first started this whole thing, that we were all in this together. We can do this together, we said, but sadly, over the weeks, this has become deeply politicized. And so now what? How do we live as a resurrection people in moments like this when we don't agree? This is what we're going to be looking at this morning. The text that we're about to hear comes from Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth. Now, when you think of Corinthians, what is it that you immediately think of? Now, my guess is that you probably said 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. But what we fail to remember is that Corinth in that day would have made Las Vegas look like a Sunday school picnic. It was a total mix of all kinds of people, all different types of religions. The type of place where anything goes, religiously, socially, sexually. In fact, I think it was in Corinth where they developed the tagline, "What happens in Corinth stays in Corinth." It's not the type of place that your parents would want you to go on spring break. But Paul had planted this community of Jesus followers in this culturally savvy city where people worshiped all sorts of different things. And Paul has planted this church, and yet he's moved on to Ephesus. But as we'll hear, things are quickly falling apart. The people in Corinth are finding all sorts of ways to divide themselves. And there was a woman named Chloe who was a community leader, a person of importance, and she sends word to Paul that things are quickly falling apart. And he sends this letter that begins this way.
Today's reading is from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 to 18. Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be in agreement, that there be no division among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same purpose. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. What I mean is that each of you say, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. Has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you, except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one can say that you were baptized in my name. I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel, and not with elaborate wisdom, so that the cross of Christ may not be emptied of its power. For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
An argument in the church? Good Christian people disagreeing with one another? Thank God that doesn't happen anymore. Then again, it doesn't happen any less either, does it, now that I think about it? I heard a story not too long ago about a man who lived in the Appalachian Mountains during the Great Depression. And he traveled at one point to do some business in the great city of Knoxville, Tennessee. And while he was there, he encountered a refrigerator that made ice. Now, this was in the summertime, and they were in the middle of this incredible heat wave, and he believed that this had to have been a miracle of God, that a machine could make ice, that people could have ice in their drinks in the middle of this incredibly hot time. When he returned to his hometown, he went to his church's midweek revival service. And there was a time in that service that people could give their testimony. And he stood up and he testified about the miracle that he witnessed. A machine that could make ice in the summer. Now, right there in that revival meeting, a dispute broke out, and some people chimed in that there was no way that there could be such a thing. And other people believed him and believed that this miracle machine could really make ice. Well, over the next several weeks, it escalated, and eventually, it resulted in a church split, with some people leaving the church and starting another church down the street. And in that community, in that city, they were known as the No Ice Baptists and the Ice Baptists. It's amazing, isn't it, the things that we will find to argue about? It's so hard for us to agree on just about anything. And not just the major things either, but the small things too. We are so challenged by this idea of getting along with one another, of being considerate with one another, of cultivating this common life that we share together. I'm always amused when I hear Christian people pine for the good old days of the early church. The time when the church was more peaceful, more pure, more unified. But the Bible, of course, tells us otherwise. And that's good news, too, because we have countless examples of how to achieve unity amidst diversity. In this church in Corinth, it was new and it was still trying to find its way. And with this strange mix of values and norms, it was starting to wander off and incorporate other religious traditions as well. The church was constantly, apparently, getting in disagreements. In fact, if you read through the entire book, the entire letter, Paul seems to be constantly pulling people apart, breaking up fights, settling disagreements and arguments. But here in the beginning of the letter, Paul is trying to set the tone, appealing to them to not let those disagreements divide them and tear them apart, that they should try to get along, that there should be no divisions among them, Paul says. Now, when I hear that, I have to ask, is that even possible? Some say no, because churches are made up of people, and people love to disagree. I had a friend in California who was a colleague, and she used to always ask the question, is it more important to be right or in relationship? Now, most of us would say from time to time that, well, if we're honest, more often than not, we'd rather be right, even at the sake of the relationship. But do you know what the word religion means? It's a good word that means to bind together that which has been torn apart. To bind together that which has been torn apart. But instead, far too many, it has come to mean majoring in the minors, being unable to see the forest for the trees, winning the battle but losing the war, making a mountain out of a molehill. Everyone is capable of such nonsense, I believe. But it seems that religious people, we're just really good at it. Adam Hamilton wrote a book a number of years ago called Seeing Gray in a World of Black and White. And he said, our desire for certainty, our need to be right, our tendency to miss the point have conspired to cause endless divisions in the Christian life. Our tendency to label others that we don't disagree with, to separate ourselves between us and them, to demonize anyone who disagrees with us. All of this leads to black and white, either or thinking. Leads people to think that I'm right, you're wrong, that I'm faithful and you're unfaithful, that I'm whole and you are somehow wounded or broken, that we have it figured out and you not so much. Hamilton says that sort of thinking is killing the church. I'll take it another step further. I think it's destroying our nation. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln looked out on a nation that was split in half. And he mused with Jesus' words and said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." The Civil War would come 2 years later. And our nation, in many ways, is still recovering from that. And today, we are divided again. More polarized, perhaps, than we've been since that Civil War. United we stand, but divided we fall. Now, let me be clear that when we talk about unity, that does not necessarily mean uniformity. To say we don't agree doesn't mean that I have to somehow convince you that I'm right and you're wrong, or convince you that my point is better than yours, that I have to convert you to my way of thinking. That being said, there are some ways of looking at the world, some ways of looking at other people that are simply not correct. In fact, they are harmful. There are approaches to life that some take negatively, that they impact our life together and do harm to our brothers and sisters. And some of these behaviors are carried out by individuals, some by institutions, some even by religious communities. And those things are wrong. And they need to be called out and they need to be named. So now what? How do we do this? When we are so deeply divided, when we can't get along, when we see things so differently, how do we do this? Just like in the city of Corinth, we all have our competing affiliations. We pledge our lives to different things that define us, that lead us to value others in different ways. Look at the bumper stickers or the magnets that people place on their cars, the flags that they hang from their porches, the yard signs that they put in the ground. All of those things are symbols of our affiliations. But what Paul is asking the members of the church in Corinth, what Paul is asking us, is to whom do you belong? To whom do you belong? You see, I think that to live as resurrection is to see that our old ways of defining one another, of valuing one another, all that's changed. that the old life has passed away, that now we have a new life, a new way of seeing the world. Paul is saying that all of those other affiliations, they now take a back seat to our affiliation to God through Jesus. That we belong to God, that we all belong to God. That is our singular affiliation. I came across a fascinating story last week about a hotel in Jerusalem that was leased by the government to house people recovering from COVID-19. There were about 200 patients from all different top walks of life, all recovering from the virus. Some of them fresh out of the hospital. Now they were forced to live together in this hotel until they are no longer contagious. The patients themselves nicknamed this place Hotel Corona. And because they had already had the virus, unlike the outside world on this strict lockdown, they could give each other high fives. They could hug each other. They could hang out together. Do you remember what that was like? Now, remember that this is Jerusalem. This is the Middle East. So you have Israelis and Palestinians, you have Jews and Arabs, you have religious people and secular people, you have Jews and Christians and Muslims. You have groups that normally in that part of the world don't mix together. And they were getting along. They were having fun. They were eating together, sharing jokes. They were doing Zumba. And because they were documenting themselves on social media, it was like the whole world was tuning in to watch this real-life reality TV show. And the surprising part in this drama was the lack of drama. Yeah, there were some disagreements, there were some differences, but over time, relatively quickly, they all became friends. One of the women interviewed for the story said that they had found something unique in that hotel, that they were all in this together, that they had more in common than those things that divided them and made them different, that they came to realize that the well-being of one was closely tied to the well-being of another, that what benefited one benefited all. I once heard a reality show producer interviewed, and he confessed how hard it is to get people to fight, to disagree, and to argue just enough to keep the reality show entertaining. That you have to get the right cast of characters, that you have to stoke the conflict, because, he said, people as individuals are frustratingly good at getting along. You see, if we belong to God and realize that everyone else does too, that all of our secondary alliances and allegiances just slip away. That's what Paul wanted the people in Corinth to know and to understand. And so maybe it begins with us getting past our own stubborn purpose, our commitment to our own views, to worry less about being right and more about being in a relationship, to trust less in our opinion and more in our faith. To whom do you belong?